We recording? We're recording. Today we're going to do a LS E90 frequently asked questions video. There's a lot of questions I answer over and over and over again. It's a lot of the same stuff, so I've been keeping some notes of what those questions were over the last couple months, and we're going to go over a lot of those today. So we're going to get to it. I'm going to look at my notes here, and we're going to go over them one by one. So first question. So when I originally built my car, I was not a BMW guy. I didn't have an N54. I've never driven a BMW before. I was an LS guy. So I had a drivetrain built sitting in my garage I was looking for a chassis for. And at the time, the real common swaps were always like 240s, Mustangs, trucks, things like that, older trucks. And I was looking for something newer, good suspension, aftermarket availability of parts, four-door in particular, and rear-wheel drive. So a lot of these Nissans that fit the bill that everybody had already been swapping, like some two-door versions, 240s, 300ZXs, 350Zs, things like that, were all kind of ragged out, hard to find, getting expensive. So I went and I found the 2006 325i that I originally swapped, the E90 chassis. And it's a rear-wheel drive car, has a good interior, has really good suspension right off the bat. There's a lot of aftermarket parts available for them. So those kind of fit the criteria, and I built on that from the start. So as far as why you would want to swap one of these cars, I wanted to make the point that it's not an N54 versus an LS battle. It's really just, it's a good platform. The LS is a good engine. If you want to do a V8 swap, they're a great combination. This isn't really a question I get, but it's a little more of an explanation. And I deal with a lot of people that have done these cars now, and I kind of see three main groups of people of who swap an LS into an E90, E92. So it really seems like it's either an LS guy, that's like me. I know LS, I know how to put them together. I had them in trucks and F-bodies and stuff like that. It's a high horsepower N54 guy who got sick of braking motors, or just basically got to the end of the limit of the platform without spending obscene amounts of money. And I'm not an N54 guy. I've never driven one, I've never had one, but I'm sure other ones can comment on that. I know my buddy Drayson, one of the only guys, one of three I believe, guys to go 9 with an N54. He's got an LS now, loves it, car's faster. So that's one thing. So you got your LS guy, you got your BMW guys, and now it seems that the third group is guys that have never swapped a car before, and never swapped a car before, and they're kind of in the same position that I was. Hey, here's this E90 chassis. This is a cool swap. These guys are supporting it, and that's great. So the guys getting into this that are new, green, don't know anything, have the ability to buy this stuff, put it together, and have a cool car at the end. But you need to go back, research a little bit about the LS, a little bit about the E90s, watch my videos. It's not that complicated. There's a lot of information available now. It's a lot easier than it was in the first couple years when we were doing this. There's guys that I talked to when there was only 3 or 4 of us that had the cars done, and we were figuring out everything as we went. So it's definitely a lot easier nowadays. You just need to do some research, understand the systems of the car. So get an understanding of how a fuel system works. Understand what the fuel pump does, what a fuel pressure regulator is. I know that sounds basic to some guys, but it seems like there's people swapping these that are so fresh that they don't understand the functionality of certain components, and you really have a lot easier time with a swap if you get a basic understanding of what you're doing and why, versus just copying someone else's system. So research fuel systems, research coolant systems. Understand the difference between a coolant expansion tank and a radiator cap with an overflow tank. These cars have expansion tanks and require a little bit different plumbing. So if you have a better understanding of that, you'll have a lot easier time putting one together. learn a little bit about the electrical system of one of the cars, or basic electrical. You should know how to wire a relay. You should understand what a fuse does. You should understand the power requirements of certain components like alternators, starters. You have certain things that are drawing a lot of amps. You need to understand what size wiring you need to use, what's appropriate here and there. And that's not to fault anybody on that. It's just something new.
Google.
Yeah, Google.
Learn how to use the search bar.
Yeah.
Watch the videos before
you
ask a question.
Yeah. Other things you should do, before you tackle a swap, do a bunch of research. I have people ask me a lot of basic questions all the time that really I'll help you guys out, but it's kind of getting overwhelming at this point. So I'm starting to tell a lot of people, like, hey, don't ask me a question about wiring your Holly. That's in the manual. All the wires in that Holly are laid out in the instructions. There's lots of videos online of people wiring things like that. So
we made a video.
Yeah, we made a video about wiring the Holly. So we're gonna do it again on the white car, break it down a little better, but be able to search and find your problems. I mean, people have been doing LS swaps for a long time and probably have run into the exact issue that you run into when you're going to start the thing the first time and the starter won't turn, or it doesn't fire, or something like that. So
join the group.
Yeah, join the group on Facebook, ask some questions on there, search. There's tons of information on there already directly related to the E90s. So the Facebook group is a really good resource. Even if you're not on Facebook, just make an account with a fake profile picture, join the group, and just use it for the information there. I know some people don't like to use Facebook. Next question we get really common is which chassis is better, whether you're talking about a 325 or a 328, like a base model car, 330 or a 335. So the primary difference that we see with a 335 is that the differential uses a unique input shaft. We have one over on the shelf we can put a picture of. But basically the 335 has a one-of-a-kind input shaft on the rear differential. Drive Shaft Shop makes an adapter flange that we just found out for that differential. But the base model cars, the 325 and the 328, use a standard companion flange type input flange. I have an adapter available on the website that you can bolt up to the stock BMW differential that'll adapt it to take a standard Spicer companion flange to go to a 1350 U-joint. So the base model cars are a little easier to work with as far as the rear end. So that's one thing to keep in mind as far as the chassis. A 330 and all the X-Drive cars all use a Guibo style drive shaft coupler. So they have one of those 6-bolt rubber couplers in between the differential and the drive shaft. There's a few guys that have adapters for those available, so that's another option too. So it really doesn't matter which car you're starting with. You just need to know there's a little bit of differences at the rear end, and if it's an X, and if you're starting with an X-Drive car, there's substantial differences. I have engine mounts and transmission mounts available for the all-wheel drive X-Drive cars now. The only thing to keep in mind is due to the relocated driver side engine mount, you won't be able to fit CX Racing headers. You will be able to use Gen 5 Camaro manifolds like we showed in the tutorial videos. Alright, the next question we get all the time is what stays stock? And most of the time when people ask this, they're referring to what kind of functionality do I lose on the car, and what kind of functionality stays just like a stock BMW. So if you build a car like I suggest and you use a Holly ECU and my CAN adapter box, the full gauge cluster is going to be functional. Fuel gauge, your tachometer. If you have a 335 car, it has a oil temperature gauge. My box will show coolant temperature on the oil temperature gauge. If you have a base model car that has a mile per gallon gauge, that will not work. You can swap the cluster to a 335 style and you'll get a temperature gauge. The only thing that won't work on the stock cluster currently is you will have a brake light, a yellow brake light, and you'll have a traction control light, basically because the DSC system is not receiving any data from the stock DME. So the traction control system does not function, so you get a light for that, and you get a brake light, which is also related to that data coming from the DME.
Which is pull bolts.
Yeah, you can take the cluster apart, knock the bulbs out of them if you want to. It's something we're working towards. So the current CAN boxes are able to be updated. So hopefully in the future, when we get that figured out, we'll basically have some, send your box to me, I'll reprogram it, send it back, pay shipping, something like that. That's the plan. So that covers the stock cluster. If you wire the car, as we showed in the videos, the stock fob and push to start button works. So you'll get in the car, put your fob in, hold your brake, press the start button, the car will start. To shut the car off, press the start stop button, shuts off. Or you can push the fob to pop it out and it turns the car off. If you have comfort access, so some of the E92s have comfort access, that works all fine. If you got a charged battery in the fob, you get in the car, don't have to put it in the hole, just hit the start button, that works just fine. If you have a car with the navigation, the center screen, you are going to get other errors that show up on the screen, but they're exitable. So you're going to fire up the car and you may get the DSC warning just like is on the dash, but you can clear it, and everything as far as the iDrive navigation, everything there works just fine. Climate control. All the fan controls, defrost, anything having to do with whether you're blowing air on your feet or on your face or on the windshield, that all works just fine. Heat, if you hook up the heater core lines to the BMW firewall, it's a BMW. If you hook up your heater core lines to the GM water pump, it works fine. There's a thermostatic valve that still works. AC control is done through the CAN box that I make. So your stock max AC button on the center of the left knob, when you press that, you're going to get a signal into your Holley ECU. Then you can use a custom output out of the Holley ECU to trigger one of the outputs, to trigger a relay to turn your air conditioning system on. When we do the 1 Series videos, we're going to show you a lot more detail on plumbing the air conditioning system. So that can all work basically as stock as well. Alright, so if you're in a state that requires you to have a working readiness test on your OBD2 port, the best way I can tell you to make that work right now is to still use a Holley Terminator to run the car. That way you can get my CAN box, you can make the cluster work, AC controls, all of that, stock drive-by-wire. Then what you're going to do is get a GM 0411 or a P59 ECU and connectors, wire that to power ground, crank and cam signal, stick it in the trunk somewhere, and run lines up to an OBD2 port. So if you already know how to make a GM ECU pass your readiness tests, that's up to you. But you can put the ECU in the car, it'll still start, get engine signal, tack and cam signal from the LS. Then you can do whatever you want with HP tuners on that OBD2 port, and that's totally up to the end user. Alright, what do I lose? Went over this a little bit on what stays stock, but one thing you're going to lose is you're not going to make an all-wheel drive car, at least not easily. If you're swapping a all-wheel drive or an X-drive car, it's going to become two-wheel drive in the end. You can brainstorm that if you want to try to make an all-wheel drive car work. I'm all for it, but I'm not supporting it. So you're going to lose all-wheel drive. You're going to lose dynamic stability control. So you're not going to have braking going on with each wheel because you do not have torque signal from the stock DME. You're going to get the brake light and the traction control light like I mentioned before. And that's about it. Everything else in the car is going to basically perform just like it would have with either the N51, N52, or N54.
ABS still work?
ABS still works, yep. ABS system actually runs the speedometer. So if you pull this engine out and you turn the key on, and you drag the car down the road with no engine in it, the speedometer would still work just fine.
That's kind of interesting.
Yeah. What LS parts fit? So if you're not familiar with the LS platform, you really should do a little bit of research on the engine before even considering this swap. So I get a question all the time. Well, I see you guys put a 5.3 in that one, but does a 6.0 fit? Does a 7-liter fit? All the LS's physically, externally, same size. So as long as it's an LS motor, not an LT, the late model LT, it's going to bolt in with the mounts. You can use a 4.8, a 5.3, a 6.0, 5.7, 6.2, 7-liter. All the engines fit. If we start talking about accessory drives, this is another thing you should familiarize yourself with an LS, is they put this engine in all sorts of stuff. Corvettes, GTOs, G8s, trucks, ambulances, vans, all sorts of stuff. So there's various accessory drives, and that's a little bit of a confusing point to a lot of guys that aren't familiar with them. There's 3 main accessory drives: truck, F-body, and Corvette. They're all spaced progressively closer to the engine, with the truck being the furthest forward, furthest away from the engine, and the Corvette as close to the engine as it can be. There's about a 3/4 of an inch difference between each one. So if you go to a Corvette from a truck, you're going to gain about 1.5 inches of clearance in the front of the engine. Truck accessories, the furthest one out, the most common, the cheapest one, fit. It's close, but even with the engine in the far forward position, so you have access to your bell housing, the accessories will clear the stock fan. Intake manifolds. There's a lot of stock LS intake manifolds, the short car ones, and LS1, LS6, LS2, and 3, all kind of similar short intake manifolds. Those will clear any of these cars. When you start getting in the truck manifolds, like an early truck, a TBSS intake, they're a little taller. Those manifolds are not going to clear a stock hood on a 3 Series. Some 1 Series that we've seen, there's a little more room under the hood just because of the shape of the body. So a truck manifold will clear an F-body. Truck manifold will clear an F-body. A truck manifold will clear a 1 Series. We'll confirm that on my white car when we do it. Will not clear on a 3 Series.
M3 hood it does.
Yep. If you get an M3 hood or an M3 style hood that has a hump, like I have on my black OG car, that has a TBSS or new body style truck intake, and that clears. Another thing to bring up, since we're talking about intakes fitting, there's 2 different styles of LS cylinder head. You have a cathedral port and a square port. The intake manifolds between those 2 cylinder heads are not compatible with one another. The square port stuff you're going to find on LS3s, late model 6.0s. If you have a square port cylinder head, you can use a stock GM LS3 intake manifold. It will clear the hood. They make great power. They fit a 4-bolt LS3 style throttle body, which will work with the Holley ECU. That's a great setup for anybody that's going to build an NA car. It's getting really difficult nowadays to find a decent cathedral port intake that doesn't cost an arm and a leg. Even LS6 intakes are getting expensive and hard to find. Your other options on cathedrals are things like fast intakes, some aftermarket sheet metal intakes, and things like that. But that's a whole nother can of worms to go down intake manifolds. But a square port on an NA motor or a boosted motor, so you can clear the hood with a stock LS3 intake manifold, is a really good option. Auto versus manual. It seems like a lot of the guys coming to this platform are coming from the BMW side of things, where the fast cars, the fun cars, are all manuals. When you get into the LS stuff, you can have a very fun, fast 6-speed car, a manual car, but typically the guys that are going really quick with LS stuff use automatics for drag racing. So this isn't which one's better or anything like that. It's just basically how you're going to use the car. You need to know what you're going to use the car for. If you're going to just daily drive it, you want to have fun driving it around town, go rip it around some canyons, depending on where you live. Or are you making a drag car? Are you making a car that specifically you want to go and run 9s? You want to go and try to run an 8? If you're just going for a quarter mile time, it's really hard to beat an auto for the times. My black car has a power glide in it. It's a 2-speed transmission. It drives awful on the street with the rear end and the gear ratio that's in it. You know, you can go about 60 miles an hour on the highway at 2,800 RPM. The thing's screaming, wants to make boost. I used to have a 6-speed in the car. It was awesome to drive on the street, super fun. But manuals tend to break parts. They're not as fast in the quarter mile unless you get really expensive stuff. You got to know how to drive. You got to know how to launch. It's not as consistent. So one's not better than the other. It really just comes down to how you want to use the car. While we're talking about transmissions, another very common question is, can I reuse the BMW 6-speed manual transmission? Yes, you can. PCM makes an adapter for an LS to go in between an LS and a stock BMW 6-speed transmission. The only issue with that is because of the placement of the engine with my mounts and to make the accessory drives and everything fit, the LS bell housing is actually a little further back in the engine than an N54 would have been. So what happens is once you put an LS in there with a spacer and then the stock transmission, is the transmission gets shoved back about an inch. So what we found out was a simple solution to this is to use a stock automatic BMW crossmember and drive shaft, which is actually a little shorter, a little different placement because the automatic transmission is a little longer. So when you put the stock manual transmission behind the LS, you're just going to use a BMW automatic crossmember and drive shaft, and then everything will bolt up from the transmission back will be stock. Air conditioning, AC. In Frank's car, we kind of brushed over how we plumbed the AC. So if you want to run AC in one of these cars, it works perfectly fine. The best way to do it right now is to use an F-body spacing accessory drive. You're going to use a stock F-body compressor and compressor bracket. If you haven't seen one before on an LS, there's 2 belts. There's a rear AC belt and a front belt. So my brackets are going to run on the front belt and run your water pump, your alternator, and your power steering pump. And then the rear belt with the stock configuration, just like I have an F-body, that's a 98 through 02 Camaro, Pontiac Firebird. The AC compressor and mount is going to be just like stock. The really nice thing about an F-body setup is that you can use the stock manifold, which is the hard lines that come off the back of the AC compressor, and they run basically where you need them to run. So you're going to bolt it on the back of the compressor. Maybe we can show a picture of that in here.
They're also linked.
Yeah, we can. Yeah,
there's
we can
Amazon
link
links to all. I've been slowly adding it, and it goes in every description.
Yeah, and you can buy this stuff still. So the AC bracket is a little difficult to find, but I believe places like ICT Billet are making aftermarket ones nowadays. But the compressor and the manifold, the hard lines, all stuff you can go on Rock Auto, Amazon, and buy. So that makes that really convenient. So you're going to use F-body spacing, stock compressor, stock mount, stock manifold, and you're going to join the GM lines with the BMW lines. We'll post a couple pictures of exactly how to do that. The only part that's a little tight is at the firewall on the driver's side near the coils. There may be some modifications required, cutting and welding of AC lines, but it's something that any AC shop should be able to do for you. So basically, if you bolt everything up in the car, get your lines to where you want them to be, you're going to cut off the GM line, you're going to cut off the BMW line at the soft line portion, and they're going to be joined together. So if you get your lines in the car, get them cut off, mark them where they're going to go together, bring them to an AC shop, have them crimp the lines together, buy fittings from a place like coldhose.com. They sell unions, like proper AC unions. In Frank's car, we have the AC lines held together with a brass barb and permaclamps, and it's been running for like over a year now and works fine. So the AC on the high side, does have like 350 psi in it, so you do need to be cautious if you're going to kind of rig that together, but you can get away with it. As far as AC control, you're going to use my CAN box. It's going to give you the input to the Holley from the stock max AC button. Then you're going to configure a Holley output to control your AC compressor. The nice thing about that is you can also configure the Holley to idle up, turn your cooling fans on max, and then watch out for conditions that you don't want the AC on. such as wide open throttle, coolant temperatures too high, RPMs too low, things like that. Rear differential. As you saw in Frank's white car, we reused the BMW stock differential. A lot of guys have questions about this because the stock differentials are an open diff. They're not limited slip. The only limited slip option that I'm aware of for a 3 Series that came from the factory is that of an M3, an E90 M3 or E92 M3, and they're a little bit difficult to find, kind of expensive, but that's a factory option. You can leave the stock open differential, and they seem to work really well. Frank's is still on the same stock diff when we put it together, and he beats on that car quite a bit. He doesn't dig race it that much, but he does do a lot of burnouts. We've done a lot of dyno pulls, a lot of beating around on the street. It works good. It seems that the stock suspension is pretty balanced enough that it doesn't seem to spin one wheel like you would be used to on an open differential. The other option is to go to an 8.8. I make a kit to bolt in a 2007 to 2010 Ford Explorer 8.8 differential. It is compatible with the axles from Seems Legit Garage. It's a G-Force axle. I have them in my car. It's been 360 foot. They're great. You can get custom axles made. Drive Shaft Shop makes some. They're familiar with the cars that we're swapping, so they should be able to help you out as well. But just be aware that the 8.8 swap, due to having custom axles, is expensive. I think the Seems Legit axles right now are just under $1,800, just the axles alone. The differential itself is fairly cheap. You can get them at junkyards. There was tons of Explorers made. You can swap them out with some stock track lock center chunks to make it into a limited slip diff. They're very strong. Mine is stock, all junkyard parts, other than I rebuilt the track lock unit with a set of Cobra clutches, and it's like a $120 thing you can buy on Summit. Comes with a new clutch pack and a new spring. You put it together, bolt the diff together, and you're good. Stock ratios on those Explorers are a 355. That 355 works out pretty well for most high horsepower builds. If you're NA, you may look into getting a numerically higher ratio, but the 355 is pretty good for anybody making 500-600 horsepower and on up. The other option is to put an aftermarket center section in a stock differential. I'm not real familiar with these. I know they're on the market. You can get the center sections. I believe they're between $700 and $800 to turn a stock differential into a limited slip. Benefits there is you don't have to mess with the differential itself. You use stock axles. What I see becoming a problem, though, is going to be the axles. I know guys that break stock BMW axles, drifting, drag racing, things like that. So yeah, you can upgrade the stock differential to be limited slip, but you're still going to be limited by that axle. So in my opinion, I would just use the stock differential until you break it and want to make more power, and then go to an 8.8. Just bite the bullet, spend the money, never worry about it again. This was LS E90's Frequently Asked Questions version 1. I'm sure this is going to stir up a lot more questions because nobody seems to ask me anything until I post something, and then they ask me tons of questions. So that's fine. We'll have a version 2. Something that might be coming out in the future that we skipped over in the Frequently Asked Questions is merchandise. Guys have been asking for shirts and stickers and things like that, so we've got a few designs in the works, so we'll try to have something coming out for that. We'll have the Hangman shirts. We're actually wearing those right here, so we'll probably do a reprint of these, as well as getting the LS E90 merchandise coming. So that's available to you guys. But if you have any more questions, go ahead and post them down in the comments below. Email me at sales@lse90.com. Shoot us a message on Facebook. Any comment. So we'll keep our eye on it and make a list for the next video.
5 Series mounts.
5 Series mounts. I don't know about 5 Series mounts yet. They're coming. 5 Series is right here. It's not done yet. When the car's done, I'll take the 5 Series mounts out.
It's like 99%.
It's almost done. But I'm over here making videos about what accessory drives fit an LS.
I know, but every video we post, somebody asks,
Come here, kitty.
when can I buy 5 Series?
Hi, kitty.
Shop cats.
Shop kitties. What's up, buddy?
Buy a mount kit, you might get a free cat.
Free cats. All right, catch you guys in the next one.